Thanks, Julian, for that pretty long introduction. I think essentially the session here will be slightly different in terms of the context. It's on globalization, regionalization. Having sat through the presentations yesterday, we have issues, for example, like high-tech, high-touch economies. We have people talking about the region, okay, reference to the ASEAN region, reference to the global market, and so forth. But just to cut in terms of the story short, the Asian region, which of course ASEAN is part of, it seems to be the center of gravity for trade and development, or the Asian century, or whatever it is. So in looking in that context, what we try to make sense of how Singapore is placed in the global value chain, what is Singapore's role, hopefully, what lessons can we learn from the region. Because the lessons that we have learned in the past decades of development seems to be a lot coming from the West or from developed countries like Japan and so forth. So in some way, we are of the region, but do we know our region? Are we connected to the region? We have companies that are also grappling to understand our neighborhood, Malaysia, Indonesia. We sit among countries that have got large population, okay? So essentially, do our companies know how to form networks, linkages to actually leverage on stuff, for example, that we do, like, for example, the trade agreements that we have, like the TPP, which Deborah will actually talk about. Do we know Malaysia and Indonesia? One of our speakers will actually elaborate on that. And at the local context, do we have the social skills? Do we know the politics of the region for our companies to thrive? So these are some of the issues whereby, it probably not teach you at business school, or probably you'd have to learn it the hard way, in actually going into that particular region or that particular sector. So these are the issues that we hopefully can throw some light on. And these are the things that probably will not show up in the equation in your cost and factor analysis. It involves risk. Okay, business is risky. Yes, we have some conversations here earlier about risk aversion. But going into the region outside of Singapore is very risky. Okay, you can literally get burnt. Okay, and it's good for the elephant in the room, the G, to encourage you to go overseas. But are you equipped, the companies that we have here, the SMEs, the Singapore companies, to handle the challenges that they will face in the region? Okay, the people dimension, the rules and regulations, okay, the laws, etc. And issues, for example, like the local godfathers, for example, the incumbents that you are going into their territory or their backyard. Will they let you into their territory? Or do you need to spend time to drink the teh tarik or the kopi, partake in forming networks, knowing their families, their history, before they even allow you into the sandbox? So these are the issues that we hopefully can, try to elucidate in this particular sector. Okay, so before me, the framework is that essentially we have Dr. Deborah Elms from the Asian Center. She will try to paint the broad canvas of something called the TPP, something which I found very mysterious until a few months ago. Even the text of the TPP was not given to the public until a few months back or late last year. Something that was, discussed behind the scenes. So Singapore is a member, or has signed on to the TPP. So Deborah is an expert in that particular domain. Next, we have Dr. Francis Hutchinson from the ISEAS-Yusof Ishak Institute. He will talk about things closer to home, our relations or our neighbors, Malaysia and Indonesia, okay, in that particular context. And then to drill down a bit further, we have Dr. Nungsari from Malaysia. Dr. Nungsari is with Prokhas Berhad International, but he also has vast experience from working with companies like Khazanah, etc. So we're very glad that he's able to make time here in the midst of the festivities to actually spend time with us here to actually talk about some very important social, cultural dimension in terms of the value chain that we're trying to leverage on for growth for our companies. So without going, and I'm trying to save some time here for the Q&A as well. So can I invite Deborah first to give her presentation, please. Deborah, please.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here talking about the future of the Singapore economy. I hope that the future of Singapore includes more women and more women speakers in particular. I am here to talk to you about the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, which I think has some really important things for Singapore companies and for the Singapore government to pay attention to. Singapore, as you may know, has a lot of trade agreements. It is very promiscuous and signs agreements with just about anybody. But most of them are not particularly useful for companies, I would argue. This agreement is fundamentally different. So if you are in business and you've been using other agreements, particularly ASEAN agreements, TPP is very different. And it's very different in ways that I think will be extremely helpful for companies, but you need to pay attention to it because it restructures supply chains. And if Singapore plays its cards right, will restructure companies into Singapore. And it will, I think, fundamentally transform the way that business gets done in and across the region. But the important thing to note is that it doesn't happen automatically. So it's not that because you are located in Singapore, you will automatically get the benefits of TPP. And in fact, I would tell you, be very careful because the folks who are most careful, most paying attention to this agreement are actually your European competitors, in my experience, and the American companies. So if Asian companies are not on the ball here, who will end up with the biggest benefits out of TPP is not Singaporean companies, it's not Asian companies, it's going to be the Americans and the Europeans, because they're the most savvy and they're investing the time and the resources necessary to take advantage of this. So in my remaining 13 minutes, wow, that goes fast, 13 minutes, I will give you a quick tour de force of what's in this agreement. So there are 12 countries in the TPP. Singapore is one. 4 of the ASEAN members are in the TPP, Singapore, Malaysia, Brunei, and Vietnam, as well as Japan, Australia, New Zealand, the US, Canada, Mexico, Chile, Peru, and Chile, Peru, Mexico. Yes, so 12 countries in the TPP currently. It will expand in the future, and it has the potential to be 20 countries by, I don't know, 2020, 2021. Now, I know you're all going to ask me how soon this will come into force. It could come much faster than you expect. Probably, let's fingers crossed that the Americans get their act together, but fingers crossed by April of 2018, this will come in entry into force. And on the very first day of this agreement, a lot of things will happen. So this is not something that you need to imagine 5 years from now will have an impact on your business. It happens immediately. So why is this one different? There are 3 things that make the TPP different from existing FTAs. The first is that it's broader. It covers all goods, including agricultural goods. That's very important, even for a country like Singapore that doesn't produce any agricultural goods. It covers services, investment, procurement markets, e-commerce, and it's 30 chapters, it's 6,000 pages. The text of the agreement, actually you can come to us and buy a copy of the agreement. It's actually available online, but it's a pain to download it. So we have a text printed for you, 622 pages of text. More than 5,000 pages of individual country market schedules. You can look at it all. You'll know exactly what's in it. It's not going to change. It's also deeper than existing agreements. So it includes a lot of what we call behind-the-border rules on IP, on food and food safety, intellectual property rights, in labor, environment, etc. And crucially also in this part of the world is that it has a shared norm. So every country follows the same rules, from Singapore and Australia and Japan to Vietnam and Peru. Everybody has the same rules applied to them. This is not like ASEAN where you get to sort of pick and choose whether you like the rules, you don't like the rules, you sort of implement them, you don't feel like implementing them. This agreement, all of the rules apply to all of the players, in full, completely. So what happens on day 1 of this agreement, and this is why it's so important, I think, for Singaporean companies to pay attention. On the very first day of this agreement, tariffs drop on 90% of goods to 0. Now that is very important for Singaporean companies to pay attention to. Again, this is not ASEAN. This is 90% of goods into many of your most important markets, including Japan, including Mexico, including the US, 90% to 0 on day 1. And from there, they cut down to 0 after that. Some of those tariff drops are significant, including on products that normally don't get cut, like agricultural products. We have an interesting little chart that shows you how Singapore can get the benefits of things that you wouldn't even imagine, like tomato ketchup. So the supply chain for tomato ketchup can be moved from Thailand into Singapore, which doesn't produce anything related to tomato ketchup, because the benefits for being located in Singapore are so substantial for something like a tomato ketchup, which again, Singapore makes none of the ingredients for ketchup. It's very important to pay attention to this. Again, the benefits are significant. It will move the supply chains in and across the region in a way that we have not seen in existing free trade agreements. When you put 12 countries and 12 big countries, including most crucially the US and Japan, into one deal, the benefits for companies and for supply chains is substantial. This is not like bilateral agreements, of which Singapore has lots, because you can produce for one product and sell it across for 12 markets. It's quite substantial. It has new rules of origin, and those of you who produce goods, those of you who manufacture goods, produce goods, you need to know there's a big difference between TPP and ASEAN, which is the rules of origin are very different in the TPP. So if this is your area, please come see me about this because they're very different. There's also a lot of stuff in the TPP for trade facilitation, and this is important, especially for companies that are moving things in and out of Vietnam, most crucially in and out of Vietnam, where we have a lot of new rules coming for the way that Vietnam handles trade facilitation, stuff in and out of customs, including, and this is important for Singaporean companies to pay attention to, self-certification. Under self-certification, you will no longer, under TPP, once you qualify, you will no longer need to get certificates of origin. You will automatically qualify. Once your rules meet the rules of origin, you will automatically be able to ship them into TPP countries without the paperwork needed. But this is a bit scary because, especially for the small companies, you're going to need to make sure that the internal processes that you have are sufficient so that if you get audited post 5 years, you can make sure that your audits stand up. So you need to pay attention to self-certification. But it's going to be very exciting for the companies that do qualify. There's advanced rulings so that now when your product qualifies, they determine what your product is. It's stable for a full calendar year. So those of you who export in and out of like Thailand, you know that the Thai customs is a pain in the ass, frankly. Every single shipment has to be, you have to go and argue with them sometimes, every shipment. What is this thing? How do we classify this particular thing? Well, under TPP, you don't have to do that. Once it's classified, that's the stable classification for a full calendar year. Those of you who don't know what I'm talking about, don't worry. But those of you who do, you must be going, wow, this is very exciting. It's very exciting, let me tell you, very exciting. There's some logistics and supply chain stuff that is going to be very important. Express delivery stuff, some warehousing, distribution, especially into a country like Japan, where we have fought 20-year battles trying to get logistics and supply chain and delivery, express delivery stuff into Japan, all opened. A lot of stuff now in here on food safety, et cetera, into the TPP, going to be important. But actually the much more important part, and the part that Singapore hasn't been paying attention to in my view, is what happens on services and investment. TPP has full opening on services and investment across the TPP 12. So all 12 TPP countries, more or less, have completely opened up their services and investment markets to one another. 160 subsectors for services, construction, engineering, education, healthcare, everything opened. Unless the country has scheduled a very specific exception, and the exceptions tend to be not commercially meaningful. Fully opened. Now imagine that into Japan. Well, Japan has always been a nightmare to provide services for, now opened. Huge opportunities there. I would argue huge opportunities, for example, in healthcare. Into Malaysia, healthcare into Vietnam, healthcare into Japan. For example, you can now set up chains of clinics to provide arthritis care, nursing care, primary care, all kinds of things around health, for example, that you could not do in the past. Huge opportunities, I think, for services and investment. There are a lot of other things in there on investments, protecting your investments, also new chapters on e-commerce and digital trade. So there's a lot of interesting things in the TPP that I think are really important for Singaporean-based companies to pay attention to. Also, procurement markets are now open. So those of you who want to move into Malaysia or into Vietnam could be very interesting. Essentially what it does, it doesn't open up every paper clip and every piece of paper that the government is going to buy, but it starts the process of opening up these markets. And essentially what it will do, I think, is going to push the Malaysians and the Vietnamese, especially, to starting a system similar to GBiz, where you will then, the governments will have to actually decide what they want to procure, open up a tender, put that out at the federal level above a threshold. Again, not everything is going to be procured this way, but big projects, big services contracts as well, including travel and tourism for government officials, will have to be put out for tender, and then TPP firms can bid on those. They'll have to have a process by which they decide which tenders win, and then even an appeals process in place. Now, this is mind-blowing, anyone who's been in this region for any length of time. Like, imagine what that will do for this region. And I think one of the nice parts about the TPP as well is not just what it does for the current members, but the precedent it sets for the rest of the non-members in this region. You can imagine pointing fingers at no one in ASEAN. What it does for non-TPP ASEAN members for their own practices. It gets harder and harder to defend obstructionist policies when there are some ASEAN members who are moving in the TPP direction. Could be very interesting, and a lot of money could be made off of procurement in particular. Also, some new rules on labor, for worker rights, not movement of workers, some stuff on the environment. It's legally binding, so that's why we think that you will actually do what you said you're going to do. So it's legally binding, and it will expand in the future. Now, this means that the whole TPP will change the competitive landscape. Again, it doesn't mean that everything changes. You're still going to be interested in Indonesia. Indonesia is not a TPP partner. You're still going to be interested in being in Indonesia because they have X number of million people and 600 islands, 6,000 islands, or whatever it is the Indonesians say every time you talk to them about how important they are. They're still there. They're still important. But a lot of what's been done now is going to be shifting into, I think, TPP markets, because the benefits of doing stuff inside the TPP for delivery into TPP markets is huge, which is why the Europeans, in particular European firms, are really taking a very close look at the TPP. They're looking at the text, they're looking at the schedules, they're looking at the commitments, they're figuring out what can they do to take advantage of this agreement, because the benefits are substantial. And if they can figure out how to qualify whatever it is, the goods and services that they're providing into TPP markets, they're going to do so because it's huge. And that's why I'm suggesting to you that you need to keep an eye on not just what you're doing, but what your competitors are potentially doing. You're going to need to start now to looking at your supply chain, because whatever it is that you're currently doing, first of all, may not be what you're actually doing. So some of you need to really look at your supply chains. But second, you need to look at what your competitors might be doing. And you need to think about, well, what is it relative to the current status quo, and then what other benefits can we get relative to what the TPP gives us and to what other FTAs are doing. And I would say some of you who were counting on the EU-Singapore or other EU agreements should stop thinking about that, because post-Brexit, those EU agreements are going away too. Now, the TPP deal is complicated. 622 pages, 5,000 pages of schedules. It's very hard sometimes, especially for the more complicated companies. It's hard to determine what the impact will be. It's going to take some investment of resources, some investment of effort on your part to figure it all out. The big companies will be okay. The small companies actually can use this relatively easily because they don't export a lot of things to a lot of places. It's the medium-sized companies that struggle a little bit. So you're going to have to really pay attention to this. But I think the benefits for just about any company and just about any market is worth doing, because again, the benefits are quite substantial. It will add up, though, to some important trade and investment diversion, especially here in ASEAN. And so I want to just flag this before I finish to say there's going to be some, everybody always asks me, well, who are the winners and who are the losers? I don't think there's going to be so many winners and losers inside TPP countries, but the challenge will be for non-TPP countries, I think, especially Thailand and Taiwan, who have a lot of supply chain links but are not included in the TPP, because a lot of companies will now start to say, why are we still in Thailand in particular? If you're an automotive manufacturer, why would you stay in Thailand when you don't get any of the benefits of the TPP? You could just pack up and move your manufacturing plants for bumpers or airbags or whatever, cross the border into either Malaysia or Vietnam and get all of the benefits of the TPP and access to major markets on top of it. That is actually going to be huge. And so you need to think about what that does for you and your suppliers, your competitors. I mean, again, the world is very complicated. So you need to think about what that does, and then think about what are some of those consequences. So the TPP, I think, is very important for Singapore. But the benefits do not come to you just because you have a smiling Singaporean face. You have to actually work on getting those benefits to flow through to your company. Because this will be transformative, but you have to put the investment of time and resources in order to make it happen for you. So let me stop there. Thank you.
Good afternoon. The title of my talk is Regional Integration Up Close, Singapore and the Near Abroad. So what Dr. Elms has done very nicely is paint a picture of Singapore as sort of locked in or placed in a lot of global and regional production networks. What I would like to do is complement this and locate Singapore in a specific geographic location, much closer to home, and look at how it has interactions with its close neighbors. So we know that Singapore has land and labor constraints, and also, of course, it is a global metropolis. So as a result, it has deep or needs to have interactions with its neighbors that have greater supplies of land and labor. In addition, it also has very deep historical connections with particularly Johor to the north in Malaysia, as well as the Riau Islands to the south in Indonesia. And due to political decisions taken by these three countries' leaders in the 1980s, interactions between these three territories have grown deeper and much more complex. Here we can see a map of the three locations, and you can see, particularly in black, these are industrial and logistical concentrations. And you can see, of course, we have Singapore in the middle, and then a little bit to the north, particularly along the southern border of Johor, we have a lot of activities. And then if we look south to Batam, we also see a lot of activities. And of course, the black lines connecting them are ferry lines and freight lines. So certainly over the last 30 years, we've seen a lot of close interaction between these three territories. Also, of course, over this time period, Singapore has grown in population size, and it has also grown in wealth. Of course, it is the largest and the wealthiest of the three territories. But if we look forward to 2030, both the Riau Islands and Johor are going to be more important in demographic terms and in economic terms than they are today. And in particular, if we take into account that Johor and the Riau Islands will most likely continue to attract large numbers of migrants from other parts of their respective countries, then we can see that their populations could reach up to around 5 million each. And if we look in terms of economics, of course, they are not as wealthy as Singapore, but they are in solid middle income territory. And therefore, they will also constitute an important source of formal sector, urbanized labor, but also a consumer base. And in addition, at this point in time, we have at least 5,000 Singaporean families living in Johor. If the RTS comes online, all this sort of thing, we will have potentially more. So the near abroad will be important both in terms of labor as well as business opportunities. So over the past 3 years, my institute has been carrying out a multidisciplinary research project on the interaction between these three territories, looking at things like drivers to integration, what are some of the barriers, as well as what are some of the trends, and perhaps what the picture could look like in 2030. And based on this research, I would like to highlight just 5 points to you today. The first is that when we look back in time, particularly in the late 1980s, early 1990s, we really were just thinking about two sets of bilateral relationships. So when we talk about the Sijori Triangle, Singapore, Johor, and Riau, really the leg between Malaysia and Indonesia didn't develop too much on this particular issue. So really it was two sets of bilateral issues. However, if we go forward, it looks rather more complicated. And so what I would like to argue is that when we consider cross-border investments, these sorts of things, we are looking at two sets of multi-leveled relationships. So when we look back in time, particularly with regard to Malaysia, the federal government was really the sort of kingmaker when it came down to relationships between Malaysia and Singapore. Johor, going back to its history as a commodity export, was always very, very open and very forward-looking and always very interested in capital and investment from Singapore. And it was really the federal government that had issues about sovereignty and so on. While Malaysia is a federal system, and this would mean that many aspects of economic policy making would remain at the state level, because in Malaysia, in many cases, the Prime Minister and the Menteri Besar, or Chief Minister, come from the same political party, this autonomy is blurred. So as a result, in many cases, Menteris Besar didn't have that much room for maneuver. However, this has been changing somewhat. And so over the past 2 years, the political climate in Malaysia has been characterized by a number of, shall we say, statements and more autonomous postures on the part of certain states, such as Johor, Sabah, and Sarawak. Furthermore, Johor has a new sultan and a new crown prince. And these gentlemen have been expressing their opinions on a range of matters, from the causeway to teaching English in schools, to even potentially seceding from the Malaysian Federation. If we look south to the Riau Islands, these islands, or this province, has been dramatically affected by decentralization reforms enacted in 2001. So in 2004, the Riau Islands opted to become a new provincial government. And what this has meant is that these islands have had to construct an entirely new government from nothing. So when we look at competitiveness work done by some institutes, the Asian Competitiveness Institute, you can see that the Riau Islands province always does very well for economic governance or economic competitiveness, but with regards to governance, it's still very challenged, and this is perhaps due to the fact that it is a new government. In addition, decentralization has also meant that the layer below the province has become much more difficult and complex. So under the new order, there were just 2 local governments. Now there are 7, and there are talks about a potential 8th one, and even carving up the Riau Islands into 2 and having a new province in Natuna and Anambas. So this also makes things even more difficult. Second, in addition to an awareness of a greater number of state actors that we need to deal with, we must also be aware of what their motivations are. And in this sense, the context in Malaysia and Johor is more reassuring for investment. So since 2006, the Malaysian federal government has pursued a geographically diverse policy of economic growth. So it's set up growth corridors in different parts of the country to try and catalyze growth in areas outside the Klang Valley. So this is very good. And this has meant Iskandar Malaysia in the southern part of Johor has had a lot of extra funding for infrastructure as well as facilitation. In addition, what is very good is the underlying financial relationship between the federal government and the state government. So the state government is used to making its own money, 80% of its own revenues it generates itself, and it also has an indirect interest in selling land for industry because it can then keep this money and use it to cross-subsidize other activities. So this means that the state government is your friend and is interested in doing business with you. However, if we look at Indonesia, the panorama is a bit less positive. So during the new order, the Riau Islands were really central for the government's industrialization plan. Really, it was very important as a way of getting capital and technology. However, this has changed. And now in Indonesia, it also has growth corridors. It has 6, just like, well, Malaysia has 5, Indonesia has 6. And in these growth corridors, the Riau Islands are no longer so important. In addition, earlier this year, the Jokowi administration said that it would disband BIDA, the Batam Industrial Development Authority. It's got a different name now. Will disband that. So as a result, it's going to be a little bit difficult to know who is your friend in that context. Furthermore, when we look at the underlying fiscal relationship, it's less salutary. So the provincial government is more financially dependent on the central government, and also its revenue base is less tied to the investment it brings in. It brings money from taxes on fuel and water and vehicles. So it's a little bit less tied to what is happening in terms of the economy. And as a result, or perhaps because of this, over the past 6 years, the provincial government has started talking a lot less about industrialization and investment and a lot more about things that are politically popular, such as focusing on culture and farming and fishing, but that really represent a much smaller proportion of the economy. So that, I think, is a little bit less positive. And if we look in terms of investment, and in the next slide I'll have some investment information for you, but this is the number of electronics firms in Johor and Batam. And these, Johor and Batam largely compete for the same base of firms. Over half of the population in both of these locations are either from Japan or Singapore. And we can see that Johor has been doing consistently very well. In the case of Batam, we see a considerable amount of attrition, particularly in 2004 and 2010, which are years where we had some industrial disputes. Third, we must understand the mindset and policy frameworks of government officials in these locations and how they perceive success. So at this point in time, in both academic and policy circles, there are people saying that manufacturers have declining terms of trade. As a result, we need to look at services to generate jobs and so forth. In particular, we see Iskandar Malaysia doing this. So it has 9 target sectors, of which 6 are in services. And most of the additional incentives that they have are premised on service activities. In addition, when I've spoken to policymakers, they have a certain amount of disenchantment with the electronic sector and manufacturing in general. They say electronic sector is too competitive, it's a mature sector, and it's too cyclical. And in the Riau Islands, while they still focus very much on manufacturing, the focus is on getting a little bit of everything. So they want a little bit of shipbuilding, they want some E&E, they want some oil and gas, they want heavy vehicles, rubber tubing. And this diversification is seen to provide security, because if you have a downturn in one sector, you've got other ones to hold you up. And here I would differ with these two approaches on a couple of points. The first is on the future of manufacturing, and the second is on the pursuit of diversity as opposed to specificity. So I would argue that in tomorrow's economy, manufacturing still has an important place. We've discussed this yesterday. And we know that Singapore, for one, is committed to retaining a core of manufacturing. And because of its land and labor constraints, there is a very, very valuable business opportunity. In addition, we also know that many service sector jobs are low-skilled, and the high-skilled sectors often generate few jobs that are very well paid. And there are few service sectors that can generate the demand for downstream jobs in technologically demanding supporting sectors as E&E and automotives do. Second, in striving to attract investment across a range of sectors, you can stretch scarce human resources too thinly, disperse policy-making attention, and sacrifice economies of scale and potential for synergy between firms in the same or similar sectors. This is the result of a mapping exercise that I've been carrying out with a colleague from the Netherlands, where we map the electronics sector in Singapore, Johor, and Batam, and we look at the relationship between them. And here, based on the number of firms, we can see a couple of things. Over the last 17 years, or from 1995 to 2012, we can see that Singapore proceeded in a very positive direction. So its consumer electronics sector and computers and peripherals, which are less technologically demanding, have shrunk in terms of the number of firms. And we've seen a growth in the number of semiconductor firms as well as communication equipment. And this maps on well with what we know about the volume of exports and export composition and so forth. If we look at Johor and Batam, we see an absence of two things. The first is, or the first thing is, we've seen very little change in the composition of firms. The second thing is, we've not seen, as we saw in the case of Singapore, an increase in value-added sectors such as semiconductors or communication equipment, but we've also not seen these firms move into new spaces that are being vacated, such as consumer electronics or components or computers. So we see a certain amount of stagnation there. So while Johor comes off quite well in the sense that it has more firms, I would still argue that because of this focus on diversity, it has unfulfilled potential. And this is illustrated by this geographic pattern of production. Seagate and Western Digital, you can see that they have their highest outside their respective headquarters functions in Singapore. Hard disk drive research centers. They also have still very, very sophisticated production functions or research functions in Penang, and only manufacturing and assembly in Johor. Yet it is Johor that has an unbeatable business proposition to absorb these medium-level R&D tasks from Singapore. So I would argue that there is a lot of unfulfilled potential there. Two last points very quickly. My fourth point is that economics is not everything. So in both cases, there is a history of attracting investment from Singapore, and these two locations have transformed their economies, moving away from agriculture, particularly into manufacturing. In 2014, my institute carried out a survey of Johorians and what they thought of Singapore and Singaporean investment. And the news is actually very good. Singapore came out as the second most popular nationality in the region after the Japanese. And in general, Johorians would like more investment from Singapore, greater ties are welcome, and they support the RTS. However, there is some concern about the price of water being sold to Singapore, about inflation, about rising house prices, as well as who are the ultimate beneficiaries of Iskandar Malaysia. And going forward, this points to a different type of relationship from one where from Singapore you invest in Johor to produce to where you invest in Johor to consume. So it's a little bit of a different relationship now. Similarly, in the Riau Islands, there has been a huge amount of job creation, and the Riau Islands is the second most wealthy province in Indonesia after Jakarta, and this is largely due to interaction with Singapore, but it has also come accompanied by a huge population explosion. So in 1970, there were 7,000 people in Batam. In 2013, there were 1.3 million. And so this has led to issues about the original inhabitants or people that were there before feeling crowded out and feeling dislocated. And this also explains the recent focus on culture and traditional economic activities. So this goes back to an argument made by Samuel Huntington, which is that economic change also leads to political change. And my last point is that for much of, shall we say, the relationship or the creation of Sijori, the focus has been on Singapore and its relations with the other two locations, and that is about to change. So over time, we will, I expect, to see much greater interaction between Johor and the Riau Islands. An example is the University of Technology of Malaysia in Johor. Its largest overseas student body comes from Indonesia, and of those, 1/3 come from the Riau Islands. The second point is that it's not just Singaporeans that want to go to Legoland. People in Batam and Bintan also want to go too. And the last is, the photo at the bottom left-hand side is from KPJ, which is a private sector, rather it's a Johor state government-owned branch of hospitals. They are very, very present in Batam. And if you go on some of the ferries connecting Batam to JB, you will actually see patients on stretchers being taken on ferry to go and access healthcare opportunities and services in Johor. So I would say that this is an important leg that is important. It will be developing, and it also constitutes an additional business opportunity for people in Singapore if they know how to capitalize on that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Francis. Dr. Nungsari, please.
Thank you and good afternoon. Start off with a couple of caveats. I'm speaking in my personal capacity and not part of my company, which is the Ministry of Finance company. So I'll get into trouble if I speak on behalf of Ministry of Finance Malaysia. So it's my personal capacity. And secondly, I am an economist, a little bit jaded because I've been in public policy for the last 30 years. So I don't get excited by too many things. So you can have to excuse me if I'm not terribly excited about some of the things that I've heard. But anyway, let me start with the conclusion. The conclusion that I'm proposing here is actually, if you divide Singapore's history, post-independent history, into two parts, and we are at the end of the second part, and take the middle portion somewhere in, say, 1980 or even 1985, then the real question for the conference is actually, what are we going to do for the third phase? So hence, that was the way I look at it. And my basic conclusion is that Singapore's first part inevitably was linked somehow to the neighborhood that it belongs, in the regional dynamics of things. But the second part of Singapore's trajectory, the more impressive part, I think, it decouples itself from the regional dynamics altogether. And it became what it is today, the very high income economy, by actually decoupling itself from the regional dynamics. So my proposition this afternoon is to say that actually one way of looking for the third phase is to say that taking into context the constraints that Singapore faces in terms of land and labor and so on, and external dynamics that are taking place in terms of whether it is the TPP, which is like an American-led thing, which will come to the China-led thing afterwards, and things that is going on in the region, that the third phase should consider a bit more of a regional economic integration with the neighborhood that you are in. So my conclusion is actually the frontier is in the neighborhood. So I could actually end the presentation here, but since I have a couple of slides, and I'll share with you. Actually, if you do the way that I explained earlier, I could have used GNP or GNI, which is actually a better indicator for an economy such as Singapore, but we use the GDP. The GDP per capita gives a nicer picture, I thought, so I used that. You can multiply it by population. It doesn't do anything. And I plotted the growth rates over the same period and tried to color code the growth rates. Now, the takeoff period, this is the Singapore story, actually. It's still an endowment, geographical endowment, historical endowment, strategic location of Singapore. But what it did was it's actually built fantastic efficiencies and efficient. This is something Malaysia hasn't done actually very well. An effective government and institutions that work, in educational institutions and social institutions, housing and things of that sort. And then it raised the bar, and everybody did this during the 70s and 80s. But Singapore did this in a particularly efficient and credible way in that it's able to position itself slightly higher than everybody else. It was driven by very strong government, but driven a lot by foreign capital and foreign enterprise and foreign entrepreneurship. And it developed an industrial base and the surrounding auxiliary services that supports those things. And that was a remarkable period because at nominal rates, it was double-digit growth in terms of nominal growth rates over that period of 20 years. That is probably not seen anywhere else in economic history. And just to show how fast it was, by 85, Singapore would have already surpassed South Korea, actually, on a per capita GDP basis. That's how fast Singapore grew on the second period. Now, the second period is the interesting bit, which Singapore more or less decided that, look, this neighborhood is not going to bring me too far somewhere. I need to decouple myself and build on whatever I have from the first period. And the one that Singapore did, and I think didn't quite get a lot of attention, is actually Singapore latched on to the global dynamics of globalization then on the oil and gas industries, actually. Singapore became the biggest export refining center in Asia. It is the top 3 refining center in the world today. Say what you want, a third of I mean, it's 5% of the economy, but a third of manufacturing is actually, and exports are actually petroleum products, and then refined or otherwise. And by latching on these dynamics and being part of the supply chain and exploiting the geographical location of between East and West, Middle East and Japan and Korea and Taiwan and all these energy-hungry economies in the East, Singapore actually totally redefined its economic trajectory, as you can see. But you could see it's still driven by a strong government. You from what it was, say, Far East, Yeo Yap Seng or OCBC or Straits Trading, things like that. You see emergence of Keppel, Sembawang, or Capital Land, DBS, things of that sort. And they grew very well. But manufacturing has begun to taper off quite a bit. It's now about, say, 20% of the economy from what it was before. Not that Singapore didn't try to create a lot of stuff, from wafer fabrication to life sciences to biotechnology, but without much success. But at the same time, it acquired new services. Business services becomes very important. I think services around cities become very, very important. But the point I wanted to make here is actually the oil and gas story. But hence it defines the challenge to Singapore, because the post oil hydrocarbon world and the end of the long commodity cycle that we've seen that ended, say, 2 years ago, since, say, 2001, 2002, will be quite challenging to Singapore to define itself, because it's quite a big hole to fill up. Now, what will be the third phase? The third phase is always some interesting presentations earlier and even yesterday. It's always about price and cost, right? I mean, national accounting can be quite deceiving for, economists like to throw around numbers. Actually, it's all about price times quantity, right? So when you register a transaction, then price times quantity. Now the problem here is actually both price and quantity on the energy side actually has declined quite a bit. But the other question, which is the topic of earlier today, was always about, do you do more of the same thing, or do you do different things altogether? And then it's all this business about risk-averse. And I thought I liked the presentation earlier this morning. So you have to really think through about the value destruction of renewable energy and sustainable growth technology and all this stuff would be the value that is created that perhaps Singapore should be looking into. And I thought productivity was an issue raised. I was surprised. There was a good Harvard Business School case on Singapore at midlife. And I was quite surprised to look at some of the productivity numbers, actually, given where Singapore's per capita income is. So you got to squeeze the soft side, they say. I got this from Victor Fung or Lian Fung. He said, you gotta find somewhere to squeeze a few dollars more, and usually it's not coming really from innovating or creating new technology, but actually from applying existing technology in a better way. Of course, you have to create platforms for exchanges, and I thought people get very whatever about Alibaba and Amazon and whatnot. But China couldn't have been an Alibaba if 10, 15 years ago, because it would probably cost a lot more to move something from Xi'an to Shanghai than, say, from Shanghai to San Francisco. But there is an Alibaba because the internet is there, but China also was able to produce a lot of stuff, and they're able to solve this logistics issue. So that is something to consider, because Singapore is well positioned to do those things. Now, this bit about whether the bilaterals or the TPPs or the FTAs and the forgotten WTO thingy, whether these are facilitating stuff or not, I reserve my judgment. Whether these are trade superhighways that firms can take advantage of, I'm not so sure. But I want to make the point about the world is actually a flatter one. This is, again, a conversation with Victor Fung. He wrote a book on this with his brother. The breaking up of the atomization or the more higher specialization within supply chains actually has allowed has lowered entry barriers for firms to go into trade. And those firms that are able to go into these supply chains by specialization actually have an opportunity to actually ride the whole global market. And I think that is something that Singapore firms ought to look at, but it has to move away from this big government-driven thingy, right? It has to be more entrepreneurial, SME-type firms that maybe young people, young Singaporeans are better adept at that. I was hoping more young Malaysians are better adept at that. So the last point on this slide was to say, if the economic center of gravity globally is moving north and eastwards, you can't ignore China. You know, the China's, the coast, the Chinese coast, the Pearl River Delta, and if they can start to do things at the Mekong Basin and perhaps even in the Irrawaddy side, it will define global economics and global supply chains in very fundamental ways. My proposition is that Singapore has to play in the region because it needs to anchor the economic center of gravity in this part of the Asia, this part of the world. That's why in my next slide, before I go that, I should also say, because this is the point on this slide, I got 2 more minutes, the choices facing Singapore has to be constrained by this internal distributional equity issues as well. I thought I was beginning to hear some views about that. You have to take into account what is Singapore version 2 as opposed to Singapore economy version 2, because it's still a democracy. You got to go to elections every 5 years, and voters, they get upset, they vote you out. At least you guys are still doing it quite well. Now, the thing that I'm proposing, because when Faizal invited me, Manu, and they said, hey, you have to say something about cultural social links. I said, I don't know much about social. I mean, I'm a bloody economist who have no anthropological or sociological thing. So my thing is to say, this is my last, I'm going to go straight down to the last bit. Actually, consider this. Consider the Malayan hinterland. And consider the Malacca Straits diagonal. You have now already in place a double track, potentially not super fast train, but double track electric trains from Perlis right down to Johor. If we go ahead with the high-speed rail between Kuala Lumpur and Singapore, that's another addition to that. And then we have Iskandar, as alluded to earlier. If we think of this, if Singapore wants to still have some presence in manufacturing, it will further be reduced. But if it wants to have presence in manufacturing, and if it wants to leverage on the surpluses that it has generated over the last 50 years, Singapore has huge surpluses. GIC and whatever Temasek is doing a lot of stuff outside of it. You should consider linking a bit more. Select which supply chains you want to be part of, and actually use the hinterland and anchor the Malacca Straits diagonal on this part of the world, partly because it's a good opportunity, but partly because it's also a counterbalance to the northeast emergence of the northeast as the center of gravity in the region, in the east, and that is actually my proposition. I cannot, Faizal said I was previously with Khazanah, that's why I'm selling this Iskandar story, but actually I'm not selling this Iskandar story, I'm selling the whole bloody Straits of Malacca story. Instead of just Batam and Johor, I'm selling the whole, because I'm from Penang, I'm selling the whole story from Penang to Kuala Lumpur to Singapore and everything in between. Thank you very much.
Yeah, my pep talk to Dr. Nungsari maybe didn't go so well during the lunch. I told him, a bit more social, cultural, but it was interesting because I didn't know that he was from Penang. So probably that's why we have this tension or rivalry between Penang and Johor in terms of electronics. I think probably Dr. Nungsari is part of that kind of makeup as well. Anyway, just to recap some of the key points from the speakers before I throw to the floor for discussion. Dr. Deborah Elms talked about the TPP, the next big thing in terms of the regional trade agreement. The effect on the global supply chain for companies among TPP and non-TPP members. She flagged certain sectors like healthcare, what it means for Singapore companies maybe in terms of the positioning of companies in specific sectors. Dr. Francis Hutchinson talked about issues pertaining to our two closest neighbors in the concept called Sejori, which is your Southern Growth Triangle. The Growth Triangle was a concept that I did for my PhD in the 90s. It seems to be some reincarnation of it now as well, in terms of our links among our immediate neighbors. Also to note that there's center-state tension between federal Malaysia and maybe states like Johor, and in the Riau Islands between the central government and the provinces. So that center-state tension is something that needs to be factored in your strategic planning for your companies maybe. And as what Dr. Nungsari mentioned, we are now in the third phase of our links with the region. The frontier that we are facing now is actually our neighborhood. The neighborhood is our frontier, so maybe it's some irony in that. So in some sense, he did mention things, for example, like the Malaysian hinterland. The word hinterland was something which I was trying to avoid, and I'm very grateful that he actually mentioned it, and he's from Malaysia, so we can use the word hinterland in the conversation, you know. And the Straits of Malacca, Iskandar region, Straits of Malacca. So in some sense, this is the broadening of the region, transboundary in nature, you know. We are hungry for land, human capital, resources. Companies need to expand to the region, and how do we go about it? So with that, you know, I wish to hope there are some questions from the floor, and especially from our friends from business here. Thank you.
Testing. Yeah. Good afternoon. I'm Justin. I'm a co-owner of my boutique law firm. I've got two questions for the panel. The first question pertains to the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Recently, there's been a backlash in the West against plurilateral free trade deals and cross-border economic integration. So my first question to the panel is, given the current mood, is the ratification of the TPP in the United States Congress in jeopardy? And by extension, is the entire TPP project in jeopardy? Secondly, what can we in the ASEAN economic community, learn from the Brexit fallout? Can we foster greater economic cooperation whilst mitigating the downsides of drawing closer? Thank you.
Thanks, Justin. Can we have another question? I'll take a few. Yes, please.
Hi, I'm Shermay Lee. My questions are for Deborah. So thank you for your whirlwind and fascinating explanation of TPP. I'm an entrepreneur. I own, manufacture, and distribute my own range of Singapore food products. Firstly, what will the impact of TPP be on an SME such as mine? In my case, chili sauce, not ketchup. Who should I look to in the future to translate TPP, such dense, large, immense policy? Would it be i.e. Singapore? Would there be guidance for SMEs? How does it filter down for SMEs? Please comment more on the impact of e-commerce.
Thank you, Deborah. Okay, one more question, if there's any. Yes, please.
Good afternoon, panelists. So my question is really fairly simple. There is a lot of, I was asked this question before because as a speaker, and they were asking me regarding the Kunming-Singapore Railway, the Pan-Asia Railway Network. I just want to ask on a very simple, broad scale, what kind of opportunities are there that lie on this railway, which I don't know when will it be built, finished, and does it have any effect with the TPP or any of the other economic growths or railways that have been going to be built in Asia? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Maybe I'll pass it to Deborah first to answer the TPP questions. Okay.
Thank you very much. These are some tough questions, so I'll see what I can do with them. The first question comes up all the time, what happens with TPP ratification? And it is a tough one because the TPP has run into headwinds that no one quite anticipated. The challenge for TPP ratification is that it has to have 6 countries in order for the TPP to come entry into force. One of them has to be Japan. The Japanese government just won in a landslide, so the Japanese will probably approve the TPP next month. So that will be done. The second country that has to approve is the US, and then 4 other countries have to follow on. So we are waiting for the Americans. That has gotten much more difficult with both presidential contenders coming out in opposition to the TPP and a strong anti-globalization backlash in the US. This is hard because you are asking Congress, who is never sensible at the best of times, to approve something in opposition to voter sentiment. But I think, I'm hoping, that there's enough smart people left in Congress to realize that if the US votes this down or doesn't vote on it at all right now, that US leadership on trade is gone. So the hope is that the US will, in fact, approve this in what's called the lame duck session, so between the election in the beginning of November and the seating of the new president in January. That's tough. It's going to be tough. But I think that there are some good reasons to think it will happen. If it doesn't happen then, when would it happen? I mean, under Trump, forget it. Under Clinton, possibly, within the next relatively, not in the first 100 days of her presidency probably, but within the first year. So I think we're still on track to have TPP come into force as scheduled in April of 2018. So I don't think you should lose hope just yet, but it's a challenge. So then the next question was, what can you do to help that? You know, anyone who's got operations should be calling Congress to tell them why it matters to them, why it matters to you, because we need all the business push and pressure we can get. And I know that, happily, the Singaporean government officials who've been talking to Washington have been making a strong and full-throated pitch for why the TPP matters, which is great. Yay. It needs to be done. Because, again, the whole thing goes down in flames if the Americans can't get it over the line, which would be really bad. The alternative to TPP is not good. I know lots of people are talking about RCEP, and I'm just mentioning this briefly. The Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership is the 16 parties in Asia negotiating the alternative to the TPP. Supposed to be China-led, not China-led. The problem with RCEP, nobody's leading. It's supposed to be ASEAN-led. ASEAN's not leading. I've been to 8 rounds in a row now of RCEP, and the challenge with RCEP is it's not going to give, for business, it's not going to give you the same benefits anywhere close, frankly, of TPP. So not really the fallback you're looking for. You really, really need TPP, especially for Singapore. You need TPP. So you need the Americans to get their act together. What are the lessons of Brexit? Well, the lessons is, you know, you cannot count on a robust recognition of what globalization, what are the benefits, why does trade matter, how does this help me? And somehow trade has become the whipping boy for all kinds of just vague discontent and unhappiness. That is not easy. That's tough. It's tough for a country like Singapore that is so trade dependent. If the world starts closing down, starts shutting borders, the damage to the Singaporean economy is going to be catastrophic. So, you know, a full-throated, ambitious defense of trade, globalization is really important for a country that is so open like Singapore, because you live and die by trade. So let us hope that that does not affect Singapore more than it already has. So we need globalization to continue for Singapore in particular. How do you stop that? That's tough. I mean, the Asian Trade Center in particular is out there sort of every day making an argument for why globalization affects you whether you like it or not, and why trade is important, why you and your job is tied to trade. But it's a lonely road, I have to tell you, at the moment. So support from companies would be very helpful for us, frankly. We are out there all by ourselves, so it'd be nice for support. How do you do? I don't know how you do this. It's tough. It's really tough. For SMEs in the TPP will give benefits to SMEs, including companies that SMEs, I think the benefits will be significant. How do you find out what it does for you? In Singapore, wow, this is a tough one. The Singapore government has not done, I would argue, a particularly great job of yet rolling out what the benefits will be. The plan is to tell all SMEs, 6,500 of them, for example, at one event, one day in August. Wow, that's not going to go particularly well. I mean, I'll do what I can at that event in August, but, you know, that's not particularly great. So, you know, it is going to require more effort than that. This is not a normal trade agreement, and it will require more effort. And so I think that the message needs to be, you cannot just rely on a website to help SMEs navigate this agreement. It's too hard. It's too complicated. If you really want them to use, if you really want SMEs or any other company to use it, you can't just have a website. It needs to be broader than that. The TPP e-commerce provisions, the TPP has an e-commerce chapter, but it is relatively early e-commerce. I mean, it's the first one. So yay, but it's not really where we want ultimately to be on e-commerce. So we need to do a lot better job with e-commerce in general, and I'm happy that ASEAN looks like it's going to put e-commerce on the negotiating agenda for ASEAN in Vision or Blueprint 2025. So we will be able to negotiate more in ASEAN on e-commerce, which will be great because that's where the future is, yay. But TPP, it's the baby steps towards e-commerce. And for TPP and the train, I would say, you know, one of the important things to remember is that TPP includes Malaysia. And so a lot of companies should be looking to Malaysia for TPP benefits. And there, again, I would argue for supply chain purposes in particular, but also for services, et cetera. Singapore, Malaysia makes a lot of sense for TPP. So look at Malaysia for setting up operations cross-border, et cetera. There should be a significant number of benefits. The government, I would say, does not need to do this. Businesses should be doing it absent whatever government does. Government doesn't have to do this. Businesses should be doing it on their own.
Okay. Thanks, Deborah. Comments, please.
Quick one, Faizal, on the TPP, because it cannot end there, because it doesn't include China. I mean, I can't envision anything of multilateral sort of or even regional FTA type of thing without having to come to terms with China. That's one. But the whole Brexit thing and the American political situation and what you saw in the last elections in Singapore, not the one, the last one, the one before that, it was actually a reflection of winners and losers in this whole globalization process. And I think that needs to be considered as one of the key parameters and constraint in actually charting what is the next frontier. And that's why I'm proposing actually this Malayan corridor thingy, because I was quite surprised when I heard Josh Yeo spoke, and he referred to himself as a Malayan, because for all that has, the water that has passed under the bridge and so on, I think we know each other much better than we know anyone else in the neighborhood. I had lunch once with a bunch of Singaporean, Indonesian editors. They were bashing Malaysia like crazy, and I said, you know, and then they were saying, why do you react so much faster to any problem with Singapore than you do with Indonesia? And I think, and then they have this big thing about satu rumpun and all this business. And I said, actually, because we used to live together, you know, for a while, and we know each other much better. We almost look the same in some sense. You can pull 10 Malaysian and put it in Singapore, 10 Singaporean put it in Malaysia. You can actually mitigate some of these reactions that you get from winners and losers. But the railway thing, because part of my other job is actually raising funding for the MRT project in Kuala Lumpur, in the Klang Valley. You know, that whole thing is done. Between Padang Besar in Perlis, joining up to Hanyai, right down to Singapore, it's double track electrified. That's done. The only question now is actually the high-speed rail between Singapore and Kuala Lumpur. That's both a fiscal issue and as well as some ongoing stuff between Singapore and Malaysia at the G2G level in terms of where it starts, where it ends, and all this stuff. But once that's done, the stuff from Hanyai to Bangkok and onwards, that's right up to Kunming, and therefore you have linkage from Kunming to straight to Beijing, actually. I'm positive about that.
Thank you, Dr. Nungsari. Next batch of questions, please. Yes, please.
Hi. Is this working?
Yeah, it is.
My name is Sarah. I'm from the Ministry of Trade and Industry. I just wanted to make a quick comment on Dr. Elms' presentation and address the question from the lady on SMEs and TPP outreach. So while MTI does have a website that includes the legal text of the agreement as well as simple to understand chapter summaries of the massive Trans-Pacific Partnership, I just wanted to raise the point that we are conducting broad-based sessions to help both large and small businesses understand what the agreement is. And I just wanted to make the point that we are working very closely with stat boards like IE Singapore, the International Enterprise Singapore, as well as Spring. And I also want to highlight that food manufacturing, which I think might be of interest to the lady earlier is something that we are looking at, and it's in the works. So stay tuned, and I'd be very happy to come over and pass you my name card later on, and perhaps you can have a chat about what we can do together. That's all. Thank you very much for organizing this.
Thank you. So you got some positive impact spillovers already. Okay, next question, please, or comments? Yes, please. Yep.
Small comment and question regarding TPP. My interest is quite narrow. It's confined to the healthcare. Now, assuming this thing get off the ground 2018, right? What do you see possibilities for us here in Singapore, tripping into the healthcare of the US and the other countries, for example? Would be it robotics, radiology, whatever, I don't know that. I'm not familiar with TTP at all, but I think if it comes about, the potential could be immense. So in terms of healthcare, maybe you can just say something about it. Thank you.
Thank you. Do you have another question? Thank you. Yeah, please, Prof. Yeah.
John Pang from NTU. One frightening thought about the future is the opening up of the Arctic route. Okay, so it's going to change the maritime trade routes, and basically the Straits of Malacca will be less important, maybe in 10, 20 years' time. Now, the high-speed rail is going to be the next backbone for freight to travel on. And knowing our past history and relationships with Malaysia, there's going to be a very difficult time when our freight trains have to run on their high-speed rail systems. So maybe you can comment on that.
Thank you, Prof. May I just let Deborah answer on the TPP first?
Healthcare. So this is a little bit difficult to answer because it's not yet clear. What you can say is that the healthcare sector is opened. In other words, the sector of healthcare plus most of the subsectors under healthcare are opened for services delivery and for investment across most of the TPP 12. So we can say that. But what does that actually mean on the ground is a little unclear because that doesn't normally happen in a trade agreement. So if we look at past trade agreements, usually healthcare is not opened, or very little of healthcare is opened. So for example, we might open healthcare, like this is how ASEAN does it. If ASEAN opens healthcare at all, they will open up, as an example, one hospital, or they will open up 3 clinics, or they might open up, I don't know what it might be, you get 5 foreign doctors. That's it. Okay, so this is very different. This is, healthcare is open. Now, so what does that mean? I don't know what it means. I think it depends on what healthcare companies decide to make of this. Now, I should point out, and I should really make sure that this is clear, just because the sector is open doesn't mean that all the foreign doctors are going to come flooding into Singapore, because there are still restrictions in most of these countries on, for example, doctors who are going to have to be locally licensed, and who are going to have local immigration restrictions on whether or not you as a foreign doctor get your immigration certificate to come in, whether you pass the local medical examination and so forth. So it's not like all of a sudden you are competing with every foreign doctor before you all panic and start calling your local MP or whatever. But it does mean that there should be new opportunities in healthcare, both into Singapore and, as crucially for Singapore health businesses going outbound, that we've never seen before. Now, what does that mean? I don't know, because I'm not in the healthcare sector, so I can't say for sure. But it strikes me that there ought to be a lot of opportunities for things like rolling out arthritis clinics across Malaysia, the same kind of arthritis clinic in multiple locations, or across Vietnam, or across Japan, in ways that we haven't seen before. Now, why don't we have it now? Well, I think part of the reason we don't have it now is because you couldn't do it before. You could not open up arthritis clinics across ASEAN. They were prohibited. So we didn't ever have this opportunity across many of these countries. They weren't open for foreign investment. You weren't able to deliver these services. You couldn't deliver diagnostic telemedicine, so you couldn't do radiology across, send the pictures across. You couldn't deliver those kinds of services across the internet. You couldn't deliver them in person. You couldn't go there and deliver the service yourself. You couldn't invest. Now, at least on paper, they're open. We'll have to see. Part of it with the TPP, I have to tell you, even though it's huge, 622 pages of text, we have to see what the local regulations are that back up this framework. So we will have to watch now as individual countries pass through those big framework on the local regulation. So the local regulation may say, although healthcare is open, here's what a foreign nurse has to do in order to deliver nursing service. Here's what a local arthritis clinic has to do in order to be present in this industry or whatever. And so we're just going to have to wait and see. But what I'm suggesting to you is for healthcare, for education services, for construction services, for all of these service sectors, there should be a lot of new business opportunities that we never saw before, post-TPP. And I think that is very exciting, especially into markets, crucially for me, Japan, where services have been incredibly hard to break into across the board. Warehousing, distribution, health, education, et cetera. Wow, a lot of new opportunities we never had before for delivery of services.
Thanks, Deborah.
On the double track on electric trains that's been completed. Actually, that's been completed. That's meant to be used for cargo as well. The high-speed rail is a separate track altogether, parallel to it, but actually a separate track altogether. I think the alignment on the Malaysian side actually has been decided. I think has almost been finalized. It's just that where the end point on the Singapore part actually that's one that's not been decided. But that's a separate track from the electrified double track, and that's meant partly because if you look at the movement of cargo, and the real threat actually is the land bridge between the eastern shore, between Bangkok on this side and the western side in Myanmar. I think the Chinese are actually building that land bridge, and that would change in very fundamental ways maritime lanes and the position of Straits of Malacca. That's why I'm actually advocating this Malacca Straits thingy, because before it loses its economic raison d'être, it better put on enough sunk costs for fixed costs for people, so that then people build on it rather than look for alternatives around it. But that's still going on. But you'll be surprised if you go to the border of Thailand and Malaysia in Perlis, the inland port, in terms of the huge number of containers that are actually brought from port of Bangkok that goes down to Singapore via rail, is actually quite huge. And I think that would be a new business opportunity, I think.
Sure, just two comments to kind of support what Dr. Nungsari was saying. So with regards to freight, basically from Singapore you go to JP, you go up through Kluang, so you go up through the middle of Johor, whereas the high-speed rail follows the north-south highway and is a lot further west. So they're two different things. And with regards to the high-speed rail, the issue is whether it's one direct line between Singapore and KL, or whether it's also going to be a commuter service and stop at a variety of stops in between. And that's one of the discussions. And with regards to the Arctic route, I mean, I think, yes, there may be a new route, but you also need to put a lot of infrastructure in place. You have a lot of capacity. I would say it would take a number of years for this to be fully realized. It would seem that a more immediate danger, if you will, would be exactly what Dr. Nungsari was saying, which would be to go across Myanmar and then into Thailand. That would be relatively a lot easier to do with a smaller capital expenditure, and that would have the potential of diverting a lot of freight coming through Singapore.
thanks, Francis. Any last question? Okay, there's a last question there at the back. Prof. Man Hing, I think.
Yes, okay, I'm Manning from the NUS Business School. Now, while TPP is very interesting, my question is there too many FTAs and has been around that actually diminishing return have set it? Now, I'm not against liberalization, but it seems that increasingly the kind of mood about anti-globalization, it seems to be growing stronger. But that's beside the point. Now, I would like to ask is that since this is a conference on the future of Singapore economy, and trade, whether you like it or not, is the lifeblood of Singapore. Now, how much are we actually talking about the so-called into the future? We are interested in the global value chain. And in fact, in the recent studies, a lot of studies have been made about so-called this trade in value added. Now, the OECD have released a whole set of so-called tables. And that actually shows that Singapore, if to continue to be relevant, then what is that contribution in terms of Singapore in the global trade value chain? Now, I think that's very worrisome to me. Why? Because in the finding, only 50% of the Singapore so-called export, right, but in the trade is actually Singaporean. You may say, so what? After all, you're trading, you rely on all sorts of value added. But the point actually underlying it is, if you're talking about the future of Singapore, then Singapore needs to continue to be relevant in the global chain. I would suppose that what are the issues surrounding this relevancy will be more important, more pertinent, I think, for the discussion and for this conference. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks, Rob. And before Deborah answered that question, and the time's actually running out now. So before I end off, I would like to hear from the presenters, if possible, based on what the global value chain is for Singapore and the future economy. Do they have a specific recommendation that can be put into a policy paper for the CFE in terms of ideas for the global value chain? So probably I'll start with Deborah to answer that question and for that one recommendation. Okay.
I would argue, the reason why I started with the TPP is that this is the kind of FTA that you need. The era of bilateral FTAs, I think, is there's no point in doing bilateral FTAs in my view, because they don't suit a world of global value chains. Companies do not produce things with the content from just two partners, and certainly not for Singapore. You need bigger regional agreements if you don't have global ones. I mean, clearly the best solution for Singapore and for most companies is global agreements. So WTO would be great, doesn't seem to be moving. So the next best alternative are deep, comprehensive agreements like the TPP. And I think the TPP, again, I can show you how Singapore can benefit from the TPP in something as simple as tomato ketchup. It will shift these supply chains in ways that matter. So that's the kind of agreement that I think makes a difference, where Singapore can add value, even in something that it has no comparative natural advantage in. I think it's very important. That's the kind of agreement it should do. So those kinds of FTAs, yes, is the future. Lower quality agreements, not so helpful in my view. So RCEP, probably not so helpful for TPP. If it's a decent agreement, of course, because it's 16 countries in Asia, you know, that's better than not 16 countries in Asia, but you only get one shot at it, so you want it to be as good as possible, so, you know, higher ambition is better. Another area that I think Singapore should really push for is e-commerce. Any kind of broader agreement that brings in e-commerce and supply chains is very important, because that is the future. And those kinds of agreements that have deep commitments that focus on e-commerce and rules that are e-commerce friendly are really important in Asia. So anything that Singapore can do to drive e-commerce friendly rules, I think is very important because again, those kinds of rules across the broadest number of countries really will drive Singaporean value add in the future.
Thanks, Deborah. Francis?
Thank you. I would go back to my point number 4, which is that economics is so important, but it's not everything. And we've been discussing a little bit with Dr. Nungsari here that, you know, even within Singapore, we do need to look at issues of inequality and inclusive growth. Similarly, even though our trading with our nearest neighbors does generate jobs, does increase wealth, does lead to structural transformation, there are also losers. And you do have social changes that come along with these economic changes. And given that these are our closest neighbors, we do need to be very cognizant of that. I would say spending more time on the ground in our closest neighbors and having a greater understanding of what are some of the local challenges that they are facing. And that would then help, I think, business decisions be taken with perhaps a little bit more of a base of research.
Thanks, Francis.
I just wanted to address the last question. You look at the composition of manufacturing in Singapore, 33% petroleum products, 16% computer and electronics, electrical, food 6%, machinery and metals and those stuff about 10%. Now, and as a whole, as a sector, that sector is beginning to shrink as a proportion to the overall economy. But the denominator is expanding as well. That's why partly it's relatively shrinking. But going forward, if you want to still do those things, you have to really break the supply chains of all these industries and identify, if you still want to be in those industries, which part of it should not be in Singapore, which part of it should be in Singapore. Because clearly the ones that are land intensive should never be in Singapore. The ones that are more people skills intensive should be in Singapore. And I think that's what the point I was trying to make. If you re-normalize your definition of supply of labor and because you have the capital and knowledge, then the possibility of doing more things or things gets to be better. That's my point.
Thank you, Dr. Nungsari. Well, very deep thoughts and specific recommendations. Could you now please help me to thank the presenters?